On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. This became the Earth's first artificial orbiting satellite, representing a tremendous feat of technological and scientific accomplishment as well as a significant boost and major propaganda victory for the Soviet Union. However, in some quarters this news could only be met with fear and derision, particularly in the United States, where prominent and vocal scientists and politicians, given the Cold War tensions, reacted with typical and expected alarm and casual anti-Soviet hostility, with notably Edward Teller, co-developer of the atom bomb, declaring publicly in this broadcast on U.S. national television that the United States has lost a battle more important and greater than Pearl Harbor. Also, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington calling the Sputnik 1 launch a devastating blow to the prestige of the United States of America, with Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri also adding and citing the launch of Sputnik 1 as the proof of the growing communist superiority in the all-important missile field. Soviet missile and space activities historically had long been the subject of numerous intelligence reports and various gatherings and attentions from the CIA and other U.S. security services and U.S. defense organizations, though some of these reports were extremely speculative given the limited and incoherent intelligence sources of the time, and in other cases, the limitations of Soviet activities in those particular fields. But as the Soviet Union's activity and the expertise it gained in the field of space missions and exploration advanced and increased, so too the U.S. intelligence community in turn focused a more marked increase in its attentions and resources directed towards the Soviet Union's space program and the program's advancing efforts, whether that be military, scientific, or involved Earth satellites, lunar missions, or indeed simple planetary probes. As the future head of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and also senior analyst boldly wrote and declared in a 1961 article listed as document number 3 of the CIA journal, Studies in Intelligence, Our Stature as a Nation, Our Culture, Our Way of Life and Government are tending to be gauged by our skill in the space race. These, however, somewhat seemingly invalid concerns the U.S. intelligence community somehow felt it had with the Soviets, given the peaceable nature of their space exploration programs and the United States' declared perception and stated public position that a race in space with the Cold War enemy the Soviet Union was on, led over the years to the production of a vast number and collection of intelligence reports, concerns and descriptions of deliberately directed U.S. operational intelligence activity which was focused primarily at the Soviet Union's space program. This was reflected in the Central Intelligence Agency's briefings and handbooks, and in both the diversity of the collection activities, as will the sheer number and myriad of the many agencies involved, also the broad and range of identified targets concerning the particular program in view, some of which were in space while others were on the ground. This included covert U.S. black operations, U.S. electronic surveillance and eavesdropping, with the use of physical interventions and blanket U.S. anti-Soviet propaganda. The grave concerns the American intelligence services and defense departments felt they had at the time would have a dramatic and significant impact, and this over a number of different security areas and fields, from the direct operational security for classified U.S. activities such as those at Area 51 in the Nevada desert, to planning intelligence collection operations against Soviet space activities, as well helping NASA understand exactly where it stood in its perceived aim and stated race to the moon, as will the ongoing status of the Soviet space program's ambitious efforts to send spacecraft to Mars and Venus, also to highlight the U.S. publicizing of any unfortunate Soviet space failures or incidents. On December 5, 1962, the Director of U.S. Central Intelligence published the first of a series of specially focused national intelligence estimates, a document listed as number 5, entitled The Soviet Space Program. The initial U.S. intelligence estimate covered 5 topics, namely the aims and achievements to date, the Soviet space flight programs, the supporting scientific and technical capabilities of the ongoing Soviet space program, the future Soviet objectives and capabilities, and the probable magnitude of an advancing Soviet space effort. Subsequent U.S. intelligence estimate documents with the same title followed in 1965, titled as Document 11, and in 1967 as Document 14A, also 1969 as Document 16A, and in 1971 Document 18, in 1973 Document 20, and in 1983 Document 38A, and Document 42 in 1985. The estimates focused on Soviet ground facilities, its launch vehicles, and space systems, particularly military systems, as well as lunar activities, scientific and technical capabilities, and the Soviet planetary probes. These estimates reflected both the growing Soviet space program and increasing U.S. intelligence capabilities to monitor and understand such activities. Thus, the 1969 U.S. intelligence estimate document titled Number 16 noted that Soviet ELINT satellites are more clearly understood than in previous years. In addition to electronic intelligence satellites, Soviet space capabilities of particular concern to the United States that were reflected in the intelligence gathered estimate included launches of Soviet photographic reconnaissance satellites, the Soviet development of electronic and radar reconnaissance satellites for ocean surveillance, the deployment of Soviet satellites that could detect missile launches, and the development of a near real-time Soviet electro-optical satellite. Also the possible use of scientific satellites to detect nuclear detonations. In other cases, U.S. national intelligence estimates treated more specialized subjects with regard to the Soviet space activities, such as the July 1963 Document 6 National Intelligence Estimate titled Soviet Capabilities and Intentions to Orbit Nuclear Weapons. This estimate examined possible launch systems, warhead yields and effects, and cost considerations, covering the period 1963 to 64 as well as 1965 to 70. Its primary conclusion was that the intelligence community had acquired no evidence that the USSR plans to orbit a nuclear-armed satellite in the near term, or that a program to establish an orbital Earth bombardment capability is at present seriously being contemplated by the Soviet leadership. In effect, the July 1963 CIA intelligence document 6 states there was no Soviet intention of an U.S. President Reagan-styled Star Wars weaponization of space. The U.S. national intelligence estimates were built on a variety of earlier reports which focused on specific elements of Soviet space activity. Included among them were reports on several Soviet ground-based facilities with different missions. A 1980 report listed as Document 31 drawn up by the CIA-run National Photographic Interpretation Center, reflecting the reliance on satellite imagery, described developments at the 6 Soviet space-related research institutes of the Soviet launch complex commonly known as Baikonur, named after a small mining town in Kazakhstan, though the complex was actually closer to the town of Taratum. The Soviets apparently wanted to obscure its true location for security reasons. Another focus of U.S. photographic satellite coverage of the Soviet space program was the program's electronic tracking facilities. Thus, a 1964 CIA photographic interpretation report listed as Document 8 provided intelligence on the Simferopol Earth Satellite Tracking and Communications Center, described by the Americans as probably the most important station in the USSR for tracking near-space objects. The next year, the CIA's Imagery Analysis Division produced a study listed as Document 12 on space-related high-power tracking facilities at 3 Soviet launch centers, Taratum, Kapustin Yar, and Pleistsk. Activities at those centers, including launch vehicles waiting on their pads and actual launches, successes as well as failures, were also a key U.S. surveillance target, as often reflected in the CIA's national intelligence estimates. The most commonly used method for gathering data on Soviet launch sites, launch vehicles and launches were U.S. spy satellite imagery, communications intelligence, and U.S. radar systems based in locations such as Turkey and Iran. But the National Photographic Interpretation Center also could find similar utility in a drastically different form of imagery than that obtained by U.S. overhead spy satellite sources, as it did in 1963, when it produced an analysis document number 7 of Soviet manned spaceflight launch facilities specifically based at Tyuratam, using the contents drawn from 2 publicly available Soviet documentary films on the flights of Yuri Gagarin and the Gemon Titov Cosmos missions. Many peaceable Soviet space missions were assigned the designation of Cosmos, in an attempt apparently according to the CIA to obscure their true purpose, although orbital parameters and launch sites provided more than enough significant mission information to intelligence analysts to deduce this. An article in the CIA's Studies in Intelligence listed as Document 17 discussed how analysts were also able to employ the specifics of the Soviet Union's own announcements to assist in determining spacecraft intended missions. However, one mission that proved too difficult for analysts to readily understand appeared as quite simply misunderstood by CIA analysts despite such clues. This was the Cosmos 57 flight of February 12, 1965. Another account in Studies in Intelligence Document 13 explained how analysts, employing radar data and telemetry intelligence, were eventually able to determine the mission was in actual fact a test of an automated system that operated the airlock a cosmonaut needed to pass through to conduct a quite simple innocent spacewalk. Over 20 years later, another Soviet Cosmos space mission 954 would become a major focus of those in the U.S. intelligence community and military who monitored and analyzed Soviet space operations. But the concern on this occasion was not determining its objective, which was known to be conducting ocean surveillance, but where parts of the satellite equipped with an onboard nuclear reactor and this known to be ailing would crash into the Earth's surface. The remains of the spacecraft eventually landed in Canada's Northwest Territories in late January 1977. The crash on the territory of a nearby American ally meant that the U.S. could easily examine the crashed debris from the spacecraft rather than relying solely on remotely collected data. One product of the crashed debris material exploitation effort was an analysis document 26 conducted at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which focused on the fuel employed by the Soviet spacecraft's reactor. Another particularly revealing account of one Cosmos mission was published several years earlier in a classified Defense Intelligence Agency publication, Document 23. It concerned Cosmos 779, an orbiting Soviet spacecraft and not a surveillance satellite whose targets were said by CIA intelligence gatherings to have included several located in Angola, Africa. The Defense Intelligence Agency account indicated that the U.S. was capable of monitoring more than just the launch and movements of Soviet spacecraft in orbit, movements such as maneuvering techniques to lower an orbital spacecraft's path, and this according to the U.S. to perhaps obtain a better surveillance photograph of a given target. The document reported further that since the 7th of September, the Soviets have apparently conducted at least 10 camera events in Angola, and that there was an area in southeastern Angola that has been said to have been photographed at least 4 times since the 20th of April, this according to gathered CIA intelligence reports. The implication of this information is that the United States felt it was capable of determining when the Soviet Cosmos 779 actually took photographs and of its apparent and intended targets. As illustrated by some of the documents in this posting, monitoring the peaceable Soviet space program involved the full range and spectrum of U.S. intelligence capabilities, this including overhead photography, open sources, radar intelligence, as well as signals intelligence too also. One component of the U.S. signals intelligence effort was an antenna facility located at Kagnew Station, in Ethiopia. This was an U.S. listening and surveillance station codenamed Stonehouse, a facility that operated from 1965 to 75 until Ethiopian political unrest seen it eventually abandoned. Its targets included the Luna 9 mission, and a variety of other Soviet space missions, including a Soviet planetary probe that orbited Venus. An article in the National Security Agency's Spectrum listed as Document 21 provides a brief history of the U.S. presence and the Stonehouse general surveillance effort, and other broader signals intelligence efforts to support America's space surveillance are also described in the National Security Agency history document listed as number 30, which covers particularly the background of the U.S. space surveillance program, as well the National Security Agency's planning and organizing to reform the space surveillance and signals intelligence missions. Also included in these briefings is the construction and equipping of the stations, including the Ethiopian Stonehouse U.S. listening station, as well as the completion and certain so-called lessons of experience the Americans felt they had apparently gained. However, some of the material redacted from this released history is filled in by another article reporting on this partially declassified history. This article informs that in addition to the Stonehouse antenna facility at Kagnew, there was a second U.S. surveillance antenna system and facility designated as Bayhouse, but this facility with an still classified and as yet still undisclosed location. Other signals intelligence and surveillance facilities operated by the U.S. National Security Agency and used to monitor the peaceable Soviet space program were disclosed to be located at Peshawar, in Pakistan codenamed Bankhead, also Cheetah in Japan codenamed Bankhead 2, as well Sinop, in Turkey with the codename Bankhead 3, and the facility codenamed Cordhook, which was based in central Norway. Among facility Cordhook's surveillance targets were what was believed to be the test of a Soviet fractional orbit bombardment system, as well as the Soviets' 1968 test of an anti-satellite system, this known as ASAT-3. The value of satellite space systems to both the United States and Soviet Union resulted in each nation being concerned about the consequences in the failure or aggressive destruction of space-based satellite systems. In addition to chance satellite failures or malfunction, there was also concern about active and aggressive measures taken to destroy satellites or prevent them from functioning properly. Such measures could include actual physical interference, jamming, sending false signals, or even the physical assault on the satellites launched from the ground, air, or space. Both nations conducted significant experimental efforts with regard to anti-satellite or ASAT systems, and both monitored the other's efforts as well, one example of U.S. monitoring being the targeting as noted above, via the Cordhook facility, this carried out in 1968. The full range of Soviet anti-satellite or ASAT efforts was discussed in various U.S. national intelligence estimates and other such assessments. A 1978 assessment, Document 27, conducted by the Air Force Systems Command Foreign Technology Division, focused on Soviet-directed energy anti-satellite ASAT capabilities. It examined specifically the Soviet Union's directed energy ASAT system capability, Soviet-directed energy ASAT technology capabilities, as well probable satellite damage and vulnerability from an aggressive laser or neutral particle beam strike. The assessment concluded that the The Soviets have demonstrated a well-funded directed energy beam program, and it is probable that future Soviet anti-satellite ASAT applications technology will be amongst the earliest missions to be considered. 5 years later, the CIA further examined this, contained in Document 39, the Soviet ability to defend its satellites against the present U.S. anti-satellite ASAT systems presently under development. This particularly referred to the U.S. air-launched miniature vehicle that was scheduled to be deployed in 1987. CIA analysts believed that the Soviets would have only a limited capability to defend their satellites against an aggressive attack by an American air-launched miniature vehicle. As a result, the U.S. anti-satellite system, if ever deployed, would be capable, according to their estimate, of attacking low-altitude satellites, including most of the Soviet Union's reconnaissance satellites. While the Soviet Space National Intelligence estimates generally discussed above covered the whole range of Soviet space programs, other intelligence community or Department of Defense products focused specifically on Soviet military space programs. A 1975 Interagency Intelligence Assessment Document 22 dealt with Soviet dependence on key military space systems, including reconnaissance, surveillance, communications, and other systems. Among the topics explored in addition to the Soviet dependence on those systems was the probable degradation in Soviet military capabilities if the systems were found to be not available. The assessment also examined the Soviet defense of their space-based systems as well as the prospects for and likewise interference from the Soviets of United States space-based systems. In 1980, a national intelligence estimate in the 11-1 series departed from the usual examination of the full spectrum of peaceable Soviet space systems and focused solely on Soviet military capabilities and intentions in space. This listed as Document 33. The estimate examines existing and prospective military support space systems, existing and prospective uses of space systems for intelligence and military support purposes, and existing and prospective use of space systems to negate those of other nations. 5 years later, the Defense Intelligence Agency published a study performed by the Foreign Technology Division Document 41 which examined the Soviet use of space for military purposes. It focused on Soviet intentions in space, the Soviet space order of battle, future Soviet space systems military employment, and current Soviet spacecraft operational capabilities. The main topic of the section on military employment of space systems is the use of these systems to support different components of the Soviet defense establishments, including the Soviet Supreme High Command and the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces. Another document written in 1978 titled Studies in Intelligence Document 28 reported that for nearly 16 years the Soviet Union has been using a deep space radio telemetry link that the United States, despite wide and scathing surveillance attempts, have been completely unable to discover or intercept. The author, James D. Burke, went on to describe the U.S. intelligence efforts that led first to a conviction that the link actually exists, and second to a knowledge of many other aspects of the Soviet planetary program, and finally, to a determined but still unsuccessful effort to find the unknown radio signal. The article examines deep space information systems, Soviet deep space communications, early U.S. deep space collection efforts, as well as any potential clues and general narrowing of the search, and any future efforts. Author Burke noted that the whole problem is more an annoyance than a crisis. Burke stated though peaceable Soviet planetary probe results have seldom been of primary importance to the United States, he wrote also that the search was an exercise of techniques that have other uses too, and that should it turn out that the Soviets have been deliberately hiding the signal by any of several possible spread spectrum or suppressed carrier techniques, then we will have still learned something very important. 6 years later, Burke reported in Document 40 that the mystery had been finally solved the year before, when on the 9th of November 1983 two Soviet spacecraft in orbit around the planet Venus on that day began transmitting at 5 centimeter wavelength bandwidths, and for the first time we intercepted that signal. Burke's later article covered the nature of the search, its intelligence priorities, and the 1983 Venus mission, and its aftermath. Also included was a partially redacted section concerning the controversial contribution that came from SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence researchers whose facilities, expertise, equipment and program was unwittingly involved and co-opted by the CIA. Almost 20 years after Burke's second article on the search, the National Security Agency published an article, Document 49, by National Security Agency historian Robert Tanyoke that provides additional information to that contained in Burke's second piece, Document 40. It disclosed that the U.S. intercept stations only had a short window to interrupt and receive the signal before being sent to the Soviets' Crimea control station, and the CIA had tried to assist in discovery of the signal's frequency by sending hardware specialists to visit displays of Soviet satellites at international space expositions in Paris and Los Angeles to take simple photographic images of publicly displayed and exhibited models of Soviet spacecraft, in a rough exercise to follow the specifications of the visible camera equipment installed, this to hazard an estimate of the possible transmitted radio frequency of Soviet spacecraft in an effort to narrow down the exhaustive search of all known practicable radio frequencies. The article also provided more information on the specific SETI equipment employed in the search effort, namely a radio frequency interference van that appeared to belong to the SETI project, yet was in the hands of CIA operatives and could monitor some 64,000 radio channels simultaneously. However, the SETI project was intended to be used to monitor any possible alien civilization radiating signals from deep space, and certainly not to be used with the knowledge of SETI for an CIA-led spying mission against anyone, least of all the Soviet Union. The article also reported that the van, which was flown to a new location, and other collection assets were coordinated by the Joint National Security Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency, as will the Defense Special Missile and Astronautics Center, and that shortly after midnight on November 9, 1983, a teletypewriter spat out the message that began, "We have it." And this after an incredible 21 years of constant U.S. security surveillance and vigilant scanning of all known radio frequency wave bands. Despite the thawing of Cold War tensions and the increasing use of space today for commercially led enterprise that includes not only extensive satellite communication equipment but private industry and individuals intent on peaceable space exploration, as well as an ongoing international scientific research effort that's ultimately to the value of all humanity. Still, the various departments of American defense and other nations' security establishments continue in its constant surveillance and directed operational deployment of security and defense assets and intelligences in the theater of space. Several further and only recently declassified U.S. documents relate of more recent intelligence gatherings, reports, concerns and attentions. It seems as though the ceaseless surveillance of an endless and empty void of space is almost certainly set to continue.